The crystal chandelier in the Blackwood Grand Ballroom dripped light like frozen diamonds, casting a cold, unforgiving glare on the polished marble floor. For Alara Vance, it was a familiar light. It was the same light that had illuminated her mother's tear-streaked face 20 years ago, the same light that now reflected in the dismissive eyes of the man who had sired her, Alistair Blackwood. Tonight was his 60th birthday gala, a veritable congress of old money and new power. And Alara, his unacknowledged, illegitimate daughter, was the ghost at the feast. She hadn't been invited, of course. She never was. But at 28, the gnawing ache for acceptance had finally calcified into something harder, colder, and far more dangerous. She wore a simple, elegant navy dress, a stark contrast to the sequined and silken creations of the other women. It was a dress bought with her own money, earned from a career as a forensic accountant, a profession that suited her meticulous, patient, and deeply suspicious nature. She moved through the crowd with an unnerving stillness, her gray eyes missing nothing. She saw him holding court near the towering ice sculpture of the Blackwood corporate logo. Alistair Blackwood, a titan of industry with a granite jaw and eyes the color of a winter sky. Flanking him were his legitimate children, the jewels in his crown. There was Julian, the 32-year-old heir apparent, radiating an easy charm that barely concealed a lazy arrogance. He was vice president of Blackwood Industries, a position he held with the same entitlement a king holds a scepter. Then came Serafina, 26, a socialite whose entire existence was a carefully curated performance for gossip columns and wealthy suitors. Her beauty was as flawless and as fragile as a porcelain doll. Finally, there was Leo, the 22-year-old artist, whose brooding sensitivity was just another luxury afforded to him by the family fortune. Alara's approach was a deliberate, slow march. The music seemed to quiet, the conversations to hush, as a ripple of awareness spread. She stopped a respectful 10 feet from the family tableau. "Father," she said, her voice clear and calm, cutting through the ambient chatter. Alistair's smile froze. A deep, angry flush crept up his neck. Julian's handsome face twisted into a sneer. "What is she doing here?" he muttered. Serafina looked as if she'd smelled something foul, her hand fluttering to the pearls at her throat. "The security is an absolute disgrace," she whispered, loud enough for Alara to hear. Alistair turned, his body a rigid wall of denial. "You are mistaken," he said, his voice a low growl meant only for her. "I am not your father. You will leave now, before I have you removed." The humiliation was a physical blow, sharp and visceral. It was the same rejection, the same denial she had faced her entire life, from the day her mother had first begged him for a pittance to help raise his child. But this time, something was different. The pain was still there, a familiar old wound, but it was now insulated by a thick layer of ice. She didn't plead. She didn't cry. She simply held his gaze, her own eyes reflecting his coldness back at him. "As you wish, Alistair," she said, using his first name for the first and last time. She turned and walked away, her back straight, her head held high, the weight of 1,000 whispers following her out of the ballroom and into the cold night. Instead of going home to her modest apartment to weep, Alara went to her office. Under the fluorescent lights, she pulled out a large whiteboard. At the top, she wrote a single word, Blackwood. Below it, she drew 4 branches. Alistair, Julian, Serafina, Leo. For years, she had been observing them, collecting fragments of information like a magpie collecting shiny things. Her mother, before she died of a broken heart disguised as pneumonia, had told her stories of Alistair's ruthless ambition, his vanity, his secrets. Alara had built on that foundation. As a forensic accountant, she knew how to follow the money, but more importantly, she knew how to follow the patterns of human behavior that money revealed. "Every fortress has a crack," she whispered to the empty room. "Every pillar has a flaw." Her plan was not a single, explosive act of revenge. That was too simple, too brutish. Hers would be a campaign, a slow, methodical dismantling of the House of Blackwood, brick by painful brick. She would not destroy them with a bomb. She would corrode their foundations until the entire edifice collapsed under the weight of its own arrogance. Target 1. Serafina, the pillar of pride. Serafina's world was built on a foundation of lies. Her currency was social standing, and her most valuable asset was her impending marriage to Marcus Thorne, a charismatic young senator from a family whose political legacy was as old and storied as the Blackwood fortune. The union wasn't about love. It was a merger of social and political capital. AITA knew Serafina's weakness was her desperate need for perfection. Through a discreet private investigator, a former journalist with a grudge against the city's elite, AITA had uncovered Serafina's carefully buried secret. During her year studying art history in Florence, a detail she dropped into every conversation, Serafina had not been studying Renaissance masters. She had been at a high-end rehabilitation clinic in Switzerland for a nasty addiction to prescription pills, a consequence of the immense pressure to be the perfect daughter. But exposing that would be cruel to the point of being tasteless. It was a wound, and AITA was a surgeon, not a butcher. She needed something that targeted Serafina's pride, not her pain. The investigator dug deeper. He found it. During that same period, to secure her place at a prestigious design school she later dropped out of, Serafina had paid a talented but poor art student to create her entire admissions portfolio. AITA smiled. It was perfect. It wasn't a crime, but a deep, shameful act of fraud that would shatter her image as a woman of taste and innate talent. AITA created a sterile, anonymous email account. She drafted a message containing irrefutable proof, scans of the original payment transfers from Serafina's offshore trust to the struggling artist, and time-stamped photographs of the artist working on the very pieces Serafina claimed as her own. She didn't send it to the tabloids. That was too broad. She sent it to one person, Eleanor Thorne, Marcus's fiercely protective, matriarchal mother, a woman who valued pedigree and integrity above all else. The email was sent at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. By noon on Wednesday, the society pages were buzzing with the news that the Thorne-Blackwood engagement had been indefinitely postponed. No reason was given, but the silence was deafening. Serafina's pillar crumbled. She went from being the season's most envied bride-to-be to a social pariah, whispered about at every charity luncheon and polo match. AITA watched from afar as Serafina's carefully constructed world dissolved into a flurry of cancelled invitations and pitying looks. Target 2. Julian, the pillar of power. Julian was the golden boy, the heir. His weakness was not a secret vice, but something Alistair valued even more than honesty: competence. Julian was lazy, coasting on the family name. He made risky, ill-advised side investments, using company funds for ventures that were more about stroking his ego than generating profit. Alistair was in the final stages of a hostile takeover of a smaller, innovative tech firm, a deal that would secure Blackwood Industries' dominance for another decade. Julian was nominally in charge of the due diligence, but AITA knew he had outsourced the real work and barely glanced at the reports. AITA, with her expertise, dove into the tech firm's financials. It took her 3 sleepless nights, cross-referencing international holding companies and shell corporations, but she found the rot. The firm's brilliant new patent, the very asset Alistair was after, was entangled in a massive intellectual property lawsuit in Asia that had been deliberately concealed from the public filings. The firm wasn't a prize. It was a time bomb of litigation that would cost hundreds of millions. This time, her delivery system was a marvel of subtlety. She compiled her findings into a professional, dense, and utterly terrifying risk assessment report. She made it look like it came from a competing investment bank, a piece of corporate espionage. She didn't leak it to the press. She sent one encrypted file to the single most influential board member of Blackwood Industries, a cautious old man named Richard Sterling who had always been wary of Alistair's aggressive expansion. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. An emergency board meeting was called. The takeover was scuttled at the 11th hour, saving the company from disaster but deeply humiliating Alistair. The board, led by Sterling, launched an internal investigation into the gross oversight. Julian, the man in charge, was publicly censured. His authority was stripped away, his path to the CEO's chair suddenly littered with obstacles. The whispers in the financial world were brutal. Julian Blackwood was incompetent, a fool who almost drove his father's company off a cliff. Alistair, in a fit of rage, confined Julian to a meaningless desk job, his furious bellows echoing through the executive wing. The pillar of power was not just cracked, it was hollowed out. Target 3. Leo, the pillar of conscience. Leo was different. He was not overtly cruel like the others. His sin was one of weakness, of complicity. He stood by and watched his family's cruelty, content to paint in his expensive studio, funded by the very empire that disowned his half-sister. His weakness was his artistic soul. He craved authenticity, but was, in his heart, a fraud. He yearned for critical acclaim, not just the praise bought by his father's donations to museums. AITA had followed his budding career. His latest work, a series of sculptures that had just won a prestigious Emerging Artist Award, was lauded for its raw, undiscovered voice. AITA, however, recognized the style. Her investigator confirmed it. Leo had lifted the entire aesthetic, right down to specific forms and techniques, from a reclusive, elderly sculptor living in rural New Mexico, a man who had never achieved fame, but whose genius was undeniable. Again, AITA eschewed public humiliation. Ruining Leo wouldn't serve her purpose. She needed to turn him. She wanted to sever him from the family, not destroy him. She sent him a package. Inside was a beautifully printed art book showcasing the New Mexican sculptor's life's work. Tucked within the pages was a single photograph of Leo's award-winning piece, next to one of the old man's sculptures from 30 years prior. The resemblance was damning. There was no note, no threat. Just the silent, irrefutable evidence. A week later, Leo called her. It was the first time he had ever willingly contacted her. His voice was choked, strained. "How did you? Who are you?" "You know who I am, Leo," AITA replied, her voice even. "I'm the ghost you've all tried to pretend doesn't exist." "What do you want?" he whispered. "I want you to ask yourself a question," she said. "What is your art worth if it isn't yours? What is your life worth if it's bought and paid for by a man like our father? He doesn't love you for who you are. He loves you as an accessory, another pretty thing to hang on his wall. The award, the gallery shows he arranged all of it." She heard him take a sharp breath. She had struck the nerve. There is a difference between being a rich man's son who plays at being an artist and being an artist, she finished softly. You have a choice to make. 2 weeks later, Leo Blackwood publicly relinquished his award, citing artistic influences he had failed to properly credit. He announced he was moving to New Mexico to study under a true master. He sold the expensive studio, donated the money to an arts foundation, and walked away from the Blackwood fortune. Alistair was apoplectic. To him, this was the ultimate betrayal, a son rejecting the very privilege he had bestowed upon him. The family's final pillar had not been knocked down, it had walked away of its own free will. The final confrontation. The Blackwood Empire was in turmoil. Serafina was in seclusion. Julian was a disgrace. Leo was gone. The family name, once a symbol of unassailable power, was now associated with scandal, incompetence, and eccentricity. Alistair, a man who thrived on control, was besieged by chaos. And finally, his cold, calculating mind put the pieces together. The timing, the precision, the sheer intimacy of the attacks, it all pointed to one person. He summoned her not to his office, but to the family mansion, the same place where he had publicly disowned her months earlier. He was waiting in his cavernous study, surrounded by leather-bound books and portraits of his ancestors. He looked older, his face etched with lines of stress and fury. "It was you," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," AITA said, taking a seat opposite him without being invited. He stared at her, a strange mix of rage and grudging respect in his eyes. "Why?" "For money? Is that what this is about? Name your price. I will give you a trust fund, a house, anything. Just stop this." AITA laughed, a sound that was foreign and chilling in that silent room. "Money? You think this is about money? I have a career. I have a life. I have never needed your money, Alistair. I have only ever needed one thing from you, the one thing you were too proud and too cruel to give.
What? He demanded.
What could you possibly want? Acknowledgement, she said, her voice dropping to a steely whisper. My name. I want you to publicly acknowledge me as your daughter. I want my name, Alara Vance Blackwood, legally recorded. I want a press release sent to every major news outlet, stating the simple truth you have spent my entire life denying. Alistair's face purpled with rage. Never. I will never tarnish my family name with your mother's shame. My mother was a good woman whom you used and discarded, Alara said, her voice dangerously quiet. And you talk of tarnishing names? You think I am finished? You think I only looked into your children's secrets? She leaned forward, her gray eyes pinning him to his chair. I am a forensic accountant, Alistair. I started my career looking into you. I know about the Phoenix Project in the late 90s. I know how you built the foundation of your modern empire by bankrupting your former partner, Robert Hayes, using insider information and then buying his assets for pennies on the dollar. I know Hayes later took his own life. I have the original server logs, the offshore transfer records, and a sworn affidavit from your former CFO, who has been living in fear for 20 years. I wonder how the SEC and the Hayes family would feel about that little skeleton in your closet. The color drained from Alistair's face. He looked, for the first time in his life, utterly and completely defeated. She had not just found a crack in his fortress. She had found the rotten cornerstone upon which it was built. Checkmate. Reclamation. The next day, a press release from Blackwood Industries shocked the financial and social worlds. It announced that Alistair Blackwood was formally acknowledging his firstborn child, Alara Vance Blackwood, and welcoming her into the family. The story was a sensation. But Alara did not attend the awkward family dinners. She did not move into a guest wing of the mansion. She did not accept a position on the board. She had never wanted their acceptance, only their submission. She wanted them to regret rejecting her, and they did. Their regret was a palpable thing, a bitter pill they had to swallow every time they saw her name in print. Power had been reclaimed. Respect had been seized. A few months later, Alara was sitting in her office, overlooking the city skyline that the Blackwood Tower no longer seemed to dominate. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from a New Mexico number. It was a picture of a rough, beautiful sculpture of a bird breaking free from a cage. The message below it was simple, starting to find my own voice.
Thank you, Liel.
Alara looked at the picture, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time in a long time. She hadn't destroyed the Blackwood family to take her place within it. She had dismantled it to set herself, and in an ironic twist, one of her half-siblings free. She closed her laptop, the setting sun casting a warm, golden light on her face. The cold glare of the Blackwood ballroom was finally just a distant memory. The future was hers, built not on a tainted inheritance, but on the unshakable foundation of her own strength.